confusion inspired by the fact that we used to have some bugs around this. I don't know if we still, hopefully we don't still, but we at least used to have some bad ones that have been fixed. Where while you're impersonating, if this function kicks off asynchronous work, then that work will also, when it runs, the execution context will flow with it, and so it'll also be running in the impersonated context, which is what we want. What that means is you can actually pass an async lambda as the func here, and it will work exactly the way you want it to work. So you can await this thing, say await WindowsIdentity.RunImpersonated, pass an async lambda, and because of how all this composes, when you have an async lambda, that's going to be a func of task of t. So RunImpersonated is going to return the task of t, which you then await, and the result of the await is the t, and the whole body of the await ends up correctly, the async method ends up correctly being impersonated, because again, it just sort of naturally falls out. You impersonate, the continuation gets kicked off as part of that impersonation, and so that continuation will run while it's impersonated. So you can use the existing API fine. The concern is it's not at all obvious that that works. And so the proposal that was made by someone else, and I'm just clarifying their intent in my comment here, was expose an async API that returns task strongly typed, and even if the implementation literally just delegates to the existing method, it'll be more obvious what it's doing.
So basically you're not opposed to adding them, you're just saying it's relatively cheap to implement then.
I'm saying technically it's unnecessary. It's not adding any, it's adding zero functionality over what's already been added, of what's already there, but I agree that what's there might be viewed as, people might not understand what it's doing, and so I don't think it's bad to add these. I don't think it's bad.
But it seems that this is a feature in general for somebody who already is searching for this, knows what they are doing. I mean, it's not something where we worry about discoverability of people just looking around and stumbling upon this API, correct?
Yes and no. There is another API that at least Barry, and I can't remember, maybe Levi as well. I think Levi's in the room, so he can speak to it. Where again, there's the WindowsIdentity.Impersonate, which we did not bring over from .NET Framework for security concerns, I believe. And so developers that were using WindowsIdentity.Impersonate in an async method now go searching for an alternative, and they only find a RunImpersonated method that looks like it takes a synchronous callback, when what they wanted was asynchronous, and so then they get stuck.
So, Steve, can you remind me, so this method, the original method, RunImpersonated, that takes func of t, that also exists on full framework starting in 4.6. What happens if I pass an asynchronous method in there?
I can double check, but I'm 99% sure that it also works just fine, because it's just using, .NET Framework also flows identity as part of execution context, and impersonation as kind of execution context. We just do it in a different way in core. In desktop, or in .NET Framework, there's a lot of complicated additional stuff as part of execution context to flow it. In core, we basically just shove it into an async local and then allow the async local machinery to propagate it.
Got it. Because the argument I would have made is if it behaves differently in full framework versus core, then these methods could be useful, because then you'll get a compilation failure.
Right.
Actually, you wouldn't get a compilation failure. So. You would get a compilation failure if you retarget it to net standard.
So, now, if we choose to expose these, then that raises the question, well, what about, for example, cancellation tokens? But I'm not sure what that would mean in these cases. I think it would just sort of be a way to avoid a closure allocation, because generally someone's going to be using this with a Lambda, and so they would just close over whatever cancellation token they wanted to use. And the only reason we would then want to thread it through would be to avoid the closure and delegate allocation. But if you're talking about impersonation, it's pretty expensive already.
I mean, so I would say another reason for having a cancellation token explicitly is that it communicates to people how they should use the API properly. I think, it basically just says it's a good practice to pass cancellation tokens whenever you do potentially, long-running operations.
It would be a func of cancellation token to task of T?
Yes.
I think that's the implication.
A func of cancellation token to task of T, func, comma, cancellation token.
Yeah.
I'm sort of, I could go either way.
Yeah, the problem with that is, again, what you said about, like, closure. We could just pass the cancellation token in already.
Right.
Or we just say we don't need this at all, it just works, and every time anybody opens the issue asking for one of these, we tell them it works. And
it works. What do you mean by it?
Use the existing method.
Oh, well, so given what Steve said about existing API in the .NET framework that now it's gone, I actually buy the argument that it would be useful to just add those. If it was like, we never had this API, I would almost say we shouldn't add it, but what Steve said...
The framework doesn't have RunImpersonated.
Yeah, but what Steve was saying.
Yeah,
but it has an API you can use in these methods.
Yeah.
Not obvious.
Yeah, there's no harm in adding it. It does improve discoverability potentially, and that is a good goal in another. So we decided yay or nay on the cancellation token parameter, since you're already capturing the closure around state.
I mean,
how would you even, Steve, if we took the cancellation token as a parameter here, I guess if the func says it was a cancellation token to task, then we just pass it in.
Yeah, that's what we would do.
So how would we even get it back in?
The concern is it adds a lot of ceremony, because you now, rather than just doing delegate open brace or async or lambda, open paren, close paren, now you say token, and then you have at the end comma cancellation token. So I don't know. And it's not like we're, if this method were going to be doing additional work that was itself cancelable, that would be a good argument for taking the cancellation token, because then we would use it ourselves as part of the implementation of this method. But I don't believe there's a situation in which we would. The best we would do would, throw if the cancellation token was already canceled. Yeah.
Right.
I guess it's fine.
Would there ever be a scenario where you would add the cancellation token back in the future? If so, what would the API?
It would be two more overloads.
Okay.
Cancellation token kind of has.
But if we did that, we would probably also add a state object in order to avoid the closure. But if you're doing impersonation, you're already making at least null calls. The closure is really.
Change your design guidelines. You don't have to pass cancellation token all the time to async methods.
I think it just says consider having a cancellation. I don't know.
I mean, this is an interesting one because there's, the thing that is async here is provided by the caller.
This is async callback, which the only thing we had in the guidelines for it is if you're converting a thing that took a synchronous callback and you're making an asynchronous version of that, consider accepting an asynchronous callback.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's like it's
we
very
also like I think it's reasonable to do this now, and then if we get feedback in the next year, we could consider adding.
By the way, it's very similar to the async event pattern that we discussed last week. It's literally almost the same, except it's a method that takes a function as opposed to property that stores the function.
Right,
Sort
anything
of.
else to add?
This also executes it like promptly as part of passing it, whereas the event one you were talking about is a callback at some later point in time.
Yeah.
Which point binding is cancellation.
Fair enough. Does anybody else use Wi-Fi in this building?
We're on it right now.
Everyone has a laptop.
Or a phone.
The last 4 days, Wi-Fi kept coming in and out all the
They
time.
announced.
Did they? Oh yeah, okay, fair enough. But last week also the call dropped because the Wi-Fi collapsed. So I just got a message from OBS that it's reconnecting, so that's not encouraging confidence. Anyway.
Be working from home this week, man.
You want me to go grab one of the Ethernet adapters?
God, you're so cute. This is a MacBook. You can't just plug in a network
I
cable.
thought they had the Mac ones in the.
No, they removed all those boxes anyway.
No,
Oh, they did?
So there's an adapter you can plug in, but of course you have to reboot before the adapter works. You can't just plug this guy in. What do you think this is? The 90s? No.
No, if it were the 90s, you'd plug in an adapter in your machine with blue screen, live on stage.
Only when you plug in the scanner. All right, so then let's close this guy here. Steve, seems you're up again.
Oh man, this is from long ago.
This is only
this
March
was-
2018. That's not too bad.
Yeah, it's only a year and 3/4. I honestly don't have a strong opinion about this one either. It's just that we have these existing properties on Socket. OS supports IPv4, OS supports IPv6. Someone, I don't remember who, made a request on some PR somewhere that we also have one for OS supports Unix domain sockets. Windows now supports Unix domain sockets as of Windows about a year ago, Windows 10 about a year ago. So this would return false on older versions of Windows.
That to me is already reason enough.
There is additional question, like, do we add OS supports Bluetooth sockets, things like that? There's families. This one seems like a fairly common. And now on Windows, so.
Just remembering way back when Windows used to have, like Windows 98 used to have support for almost Unix domain sockets, and then they ripped it out because malware was taken.
Like almost? That's good.
Almost.
We should have an API for this. Almost supports the main socket.
Capability, API.
Alternative.
Capability API.
Which is almost certainly what the implementation is going to do. That's what we currently do. We just do it once and cache it.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, you seem to have some objection because you were not super keen on adding it. What's your rationale?
Capability seems fine.
You said that, but you said this after like, nah, I don't know.
Oh, just I mean, like so the only hesitation is just following up on there's a bunch of other capability APIs that we could add. So is it, do we want to do one now versus actually be like, here are the 17 we want to add? Like,
Well, and if we
they
think,
trickle in, that's fine.
is there 17 possibility in the future? Because
There's
then
tons.
we may want to think about other API than just adding Boolean.
Well, this
Properties.
has, I mean, this does nicely match what's already there.
I know. So if it's just third and the fourth one, then yes. But if we truly think there are 17 coming in the future,
Sure.
then I would say adding 17 Boolean properties. seems-
Do we actually have APIs that allow you to program against Unix domain sockets?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do, yeah. We added them in 2.1.
There are many address families, but
Oh, that's what it
They're
says
all
here,
super
huh?
rare. So,
I mean, I think Jeremy's point, I think, like, if you just want to make it a bit broader, right? If you imagine you walk the list and you're like, okay, if we would have to expose all of them, how would we do that? Maybe we end up with a flag xenum or something, right? Versus, oh, we add one, and then, 2 releases later, it's like, oh, no, we have created a mess because we've never seen the full list, right? I mean, that would be the only reason.
That's totally valid. One caveat to that is the domain of the design of sockets today with the whole endpoint kind of class hierarchy generally means that each of these different kinds of sockets that you're creating is going to require a different concrete endpoint class. Like we have IP endpoint, we added Unix domain socket endpoint. I imagine if we were going to add another OS supports Bluetooth sockets or whatever, there's probably a Bluetooth endpoint that we then need to go and add or something similar. So there's probably, I'm waving my hands a little bit, but there's probably going to be additional API that we end up needing to add for each of those 17.
Okay, so the belief is if we add this one, then we are at feature parity between the address families that we have active support for and the capability API. Like that we support.
I think we only have 3 concrete endpoint types today: DNS endpoint, IP endpoint, and Unix domain socket endpoint. And DNS endpoint is just about mapping names via DNS to IPv4 and IPv6.
Okay. And this new proposed property goes on the socket type instead of the Unix domain socket endpoint type? Okay.
Out of curiosity, why?
It's also socket and not endpoint.
Oh, I see. So the other one is not a derived type of socket.
Correct, it's a derived type of endpoint.
Okay, that would be very odd.
Okay, fair.
I mean, like that could mean that one of an answer is that we make endpoint. I guess the problem is we want static virtual language. We must implement this thing. People must call it. Okay.
Static virtual.
Yeah.
I think I need to get the beer first.
I guess I want static abstract. Yeah. So I guess the question is, would it be better for this to live on the endpoint class? But if we already have 2 of them here, and we think that we're going to have 3, and maybe have a 4th, and no more, then
Well,
simple.
I would expect that we might have a 4th near term if someone wants to actively work on Bluetooth for non-Windows platforms. Because we do have Bluetooth support, not inbox, but via the Win10 APIs that you can now pull down and use for NetCore apps. But there's likely going to be new standards coming out in the well. So I doubt that we'll end up with like just 4 and be done.
Sure, but is that a problem for
we could add
10
more in
years
the
down the
future,
road? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if that's a 10-year from now issue, then
You no longer care because you're all retired.
basically.
That seems fair.
Well, I mean, we will have reinvented this entire abstraction within 10 years anyway, so.
When's the Rainbow Crystal? 25?
Yeah.
Okay. As long as it's 10 years and 6 months.
So you're planning to retire in 10 years?
Yeah.
If not, you should push back.
I thought I just joined. Okay.
Hey man, the stock keeps growing like it's the
Yeah.
By the way, your next project is going to be writing a YAML parser. You don't know this yet, but like, it's coming your way. You guys all laugh, but I'm actually somewhat serious. All right, so then, any objection approving this API then? I guess not. All right, let me post this comment. Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. I guess Steve is on today.
Oh, yay me. So we've had several requests for diagnostic purposes to understand how many elements are currently in a given channel. And So people haven't required a 100% accurate count because things are changing constantly, but they want to know approximately how many items are there. We went through a whole bunch of naming. This started at count, and then I provided some feedback that maybe we should move away from that, and we ended up with estimated count, and then I provided feedback that I thought about it more, and count is probably fine. So I think the final thing here ended up just being a count property on something, channel of T, or yeah.
I was about to ask it because it sounds like it's on channel, the non-generic one.
No, it would need to be on. I mean, we should talk about where it would live. It would either need to be on channel of T or channel reader of T, depending on what we were hoping to achieve, I think.
Okay.
If it's how many items you want to be able to pull from it, then you probably want it on channel reader. If we wanted to sort of how many items are in this whole thing, then we want it on there's a channel of T in, T out, basically. We put it on that probably.
So why do you think that skipping the estimated prefix is okay?
Like on concurrent collections, it's a similar thing, and we just used count there because it implements the the normal collection interfaces, and so if you are using this thing in a if you pause the world and then you take a look at it, it's going to be correct. It's only if you're concurrently changing it while you're accessing it, and if you're doing that, then it's the same as accessing a concurrent collection while it's changing. And you have to understand that the moment you read it, and then the moment after that, it could have been changed, and it's just the nature of concurrency.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. It's basically precise at some point in time. That may not be the point where you're executing the next line of code.
Right.
Okay.
That's also similar to the GT APIs we added for checking statistics.
I mean, technically, you could imagine to your the precise. Someone said precise at a moment in time. I mean, technically, you could have a channel implementation where that wasn't true, where it's to compute the count. You might end up with some value that was actually never there, but that'd be pretty rare, and I don't think it's worth worrying about.
Is getting this count a cheap operation?
For the most part, the main channel that we have is a concurrent queue underneath, and concurrent queue is a linked list of segments.
Okay.
But the segments grow in size. So you start out with one that's 128 elements, and then one that's 256 elements, and then 512. So it's a relatively short list generally. We do need to walk the list if there's multiple segments.
So okay.
So you have a queue of segments?
We have a concurrent queue is actually under the covers a linked list of circular arrays.
Okay, but concurrent queue itself exposes a count property.
It does. Yeah.
So,
But it walks the list.
It walks the list of segments, yeah. So each segment is an O1 operation, but there might be, order log n segments, basically.
It's
Really?
It's only for be a little slower.
Yeah, I mean, I would object to someone using this in any, on any hot path. You wouldn't want to do that. You'd want to use the try methods, try peek, try read, or whatever.
Right, but looking at the original justification, they seem to want to know, not, as I said, not between 0 and 2, but between 5 and 10,000 of do I need to make something start eating things fast?
Yeah, I imagine the scenario here is like a health monitoring page or something.
Right.
So this is
So eventing, health monitoring, bugging.
Yeah. Debug. It may be diagnostics. It may be work scheduler. It may be.
I mean, it's
I imagine
information.
this is going to be polled on some, hopefully, relatively infrequent frequency.
Do we normally discourage people from accessing things like concurrent dictionary.count?
We do, primarily because it's not as cheap as one would like. Like concurrent dictionary.count. Concurrent dictionary is implemented as a partitioned set of collections, effectively.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right
and
now. It looks like it takes a lock in order to get the count.
It takes multiple locks. Every one of those has its own write lock, and it takes all of them.
So it sounds like there's already precedent with our concurrent collections that the count property might not necessarily be the cheapest thing in the world.
Yeah. And we've tried, obviously we've tried wherever possible to make them as cheap as we reasonably can. In fact, we had arguably a bug that we fixed. When I rewrote concurrent queue in 2.0, I thought it was okay to make count much more expensive in exchange for making other things much faster. And it turned out that some people were actually using it on a hot path. Like if count is greater than 0, then try DQ. So we fixed that for 2.1, I think it was. Found a way to do it without sacrificing other stuff. But the moral of the story is developers will do it even though we don't want them to.
Yeah.
So looking at concurrent queue, like our docs for count mention if you cared about 0 or non-zero, use isEmpty instead. Do we already have isEmpty on channel, and should we add it?
We don't. We could. At least I don't think we do.
What would you do with isEmpty?
We're calling count greater than 0 on concurrent queue when they should have been calling isEmpty, which is probably we understand when we're transitioning to and from 0, so we can set this once.
But then you call DQ, which might blow up if some other thread has emptied.
Well, I don't think there's a DQ. I think there's only try DQ.
Oh.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like,
sure.
Again, if you're, I don't know what the justification. I'm just looking at the remarks, and like I was wondering if we commented about that it's login or what. So I'm just asking questions.
Yep, that's fair.
So where should this API live? Channel of T?
So that's what I'm wondering. I'm sort of looking at the APIs now. I'm having a debate with myself. I'm kind of wondering if we should put it on both channel reader and channel writer.
The channel of T right now is empty, right? It doesn't have anything.
Channel T just derives from channel of T, T, because the 99% use case is you only have one type that goes into your channel. But technically, you could have a channel that was doing a transformation, which is why we support writers and readers having different types.
Right.
So we could just put it on channel of T write, T read, and then it would naturally be available to channel of T. We could put it on just channel of T and say it only makes sense in that use case. Or we could put it on both the reader and the writer, which is arguably the most flexible, although it's probably overkill.
Yeah, given that I have used the API exactly 0 times so far, I do not have an informed opinion.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we put it on channel of T or channel of T write, T read, and then later on somebody wants it on the reader writer, and then we have it in all places, which would not be helpful, right? At that point, we might as well just add it right now to reader and writer and be done with it.
Why don't we go with that, and then let's double check with some of the people that asked for it to make sure that that meets their needs.
You mean reader writer or?
Yeah, on the reader and on the writer.
So it would be it's not abstract, I would imagine, because we can't break existing implementations.
No, it's going to have to be virtual, and we're going to have some default implementation, for example, returning -1 or 0. The alternative would be, a try get count, which would return false. All of our implementations would return true, but we would by default return false.
Returning 0 maybe not
the right way
to do it.
Yeah, I'd either return -1 or throw them out implement.
That's also an option.
Like if we think that we have the only implementations and we're going to fix all of them, then throw them out implement exception. on that map. It tells somebody, hey, your channel needs to go add support for this new API.
Are we gonna have also a tester to test whether it's supported?
You just fix it, bro.
I mean, if that was the route we were going to go, I would make it a try method.
Yeah.
If we were concerned about that.
And we think we have the only implementations basically in box.
Yeah, I don't know.
We certainly have the vast majority of them in
We must
box.
use this API for that.
How is that possible? According to the
I mean,
company.
we build flexibility into the abstraction, but for the 99.9% case, you either just want an unbounded or a bounded queue, and that's what we have.
Well, we have a developer on our team that is planning to use Channel.
And write a custom one, or just use the built-in ones?
That one I don't know. I can ask him. But
Okay.
he's doing basically processing of events in event hubs.
Cool.
And
Yeah, I mean, in general, usage and feedback would be great. So, yeah.
Is the other thing that I don't want to have is a property, like a virtual property, not abstract, whose implementation throws an exception. Because if I am, for whatever reason, subclassing this, and I just use IntelliSense saying fill in all of the abstraction, now all of a sudden there's some core functionality which I forgot to fill in because the IDE didn't tell me.
well, since it's estimated count, we can return 1,258.
-1.
Well, I think we were going with just count, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, 42 sounds like the right answer.
I think the trick is it had to be accurate at some point. Your number strikes me as have never
But
been
maybe
accurate.
0 is the right.
0 was at least correct at some point.
Zero, I would worry. Like -1 is a clear sign it's not working. Exception's a clear sign.
Yeah, 0 means you're empty.
It's such a weird pattern. We don't have it anywhere else because now the usage is get the count, check whether it's not -1. Like,
I mean, honestly, we have
So
other options, right? Another
So
option
then
is
I think try get count is the right answer. Then I was sort of on the fence about it, but if we can't figure out a good default, there's an obvious good default for try get count. Plus, it means that an implementation which for some reason is unable to provide a count has an out.
Is this an OOB type or is this only available to NetCore?
Both.
Yeah.
We have a NuGet package
I was gonna
and
say,
it typed inbox.
it is a major version. We could start introducing new abstracts.
I mean, that's what I
What?
said. Like,
Yeah.
is that now allowed?
well, we make breaking changes
We
between
can-
major versions and
like-
core.
We've never done it. I'm introducing the concept that we could start taking
I don't
like
think you should.
because I know that we've added a lot of things in like crypto that are virtual throw because you can't implement them and can't introduce abstracts. But if you're actually extending the type, you have to override it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have another option, right? Another option is we can introduce this idea of a soft abstract, right? It's a custom attribute you put on the method, and you basically in source code it becomes a breaking change. You basically
Must override.
you basically get a warning or an error that says you're inheriting from this type, you're not overriding this member, you should override this member.
Well, so
That's
main
called
thing that I
abstract.
worry about is
No, because abstract will not be an ABI breaking change. Binaries will work and bind, but in source code, you basically when you recompile, you get told you need to do
I don't
this.
think we can do it because imagine that I wrote a component on previous version
Yeah.
and it didn't have this abstract property. Now I loaded my component into a process that forced an upgrade because of some other reusable library.
Well, you're talking about that we can't make a breaking change in binary form. That's why I'm suggesting making it an analyzer.
We could make it abstract in the
But what would the default
implementation.
implementation return?
Well, the default implementation could either throw, which is basically what Jeremy is proposing for the crypto APIs, or we could go with the try pattern. But either way, even if you go with the try pattern, you would still say there's a virtual try count. You should still override this thing, right? I mean, like,
Oh yeah.
so like, but how do you know that? Because right now the problem is as soon as you extend an abstract type, one of the values for the compiler is it tells you here's the methods you have to override, and now we're adding more and more functionality that you just have to know that you should override. Right? It's the same problem with text reader where the default forces you to implement write char or whatever, but you probably want to override all the other ones as well. Otherwise, your shit is horribly slow, right? So,
But at least it works.
at least it works. But like strictly speaking, in the editor, you should probably get the
Yeah.
information that you should do something else.
So by the way, one more thing. Formally, our current guidelines say you should do tester doer.
Which is
Yeah,
the try
in which
method?
case I'd rather just have the try method.
Yeah.
Ability can count and count. Then you have to override both of them.
Okay, in that case, I would say try count seems more natural.
Yeah.
Change the guidelines. It's literally an alternative to the tester doer.
But
For the
the
support.
try pattern says it is an alternative to tester doer.
Yeah, but it also, I mean,
It describes it
I
as that.
prefer the try one in
Yeah,
general.
I thought it's it's an
I mean,
alternative.
the tester doer thing, like generally my understanding of them is you can assume that if it returns true, like you could call the thing any number of times and it's going to work. I mean, that's not always true, but that's how I sort of interpret it. Whereas with the try method, you know, I feel like it's more understood that at any given moment it might return false, which in my opinion is better maps to the idea of concurrency.
Oh, really?
But
Why?
wouldn't
This
you
would
only
not
have-
change. This depends on the implementation of the type, not on the state of the object.
Maybe. I mean, for
Jesus
example,
Christ,
imagine someone decided they wanted, you know, count to be very cheap, and so if count was going to have to take a lock that was currently held by someone else, they could just say, you know what, I can't get the count right now, because the alternative would be to block for some long period of time potentially.
Let's see. You're actually saying try get count is actually more flexible if you ever have to be more flexible.
I think so.
I'm skeptical that anybody would implement it. Like, would we really implement any of our channels like that?
I don't plan to for the 3 concrete implementations that we have. But I think, I mean, there are similar things that we do in other places. And so I wouldn't sort of dismiss it outright. You know, for example, there are places where there's a pool of something that we want to access, but it's cheaper to just allocate a new one than it is to block waiting for the pool to be available. So we do a try enter, and if we fail to enter the lock, then we just allocate a new one. I could imagine similar situations with, you know, getting a count.
Right. Are you happy then?
It's good to me.
Yeah. Nobody else seems to make any faces.
I find it strange, but I really think that try is for things that are dynamic, not static. And we want it to be static. We want at some point in the future, when we are in .NET 8, to even not worry about it. And if it's a try get count, forever you have to keep checking it.
Like, I would much rather it just be virtual negative.
But then you're still going to check it. You're just going to check the results rather than calling it.
Yeah, it's basically checking false versus checking negative.
Well, I mean, probably most of the checks will be larger than 0, right? So that will just work.
Or you're just going to
What's
log
the
it.
downside of throwing?
Take the breaking change.
How many people are actually subclass? Throwing
Yeah.
seems like a thing to do.
Right. Yeah. Again, that was mostly our argument with the crypto types, is we expect essentially no one to have written a custom type. Oren, who's the only one that we know that's ever actually derived our stuff.
I mean, honestly,
Takes the
throwing,
change.
the nice thing with
But
throwing is
that means
force the
anyone who
conversions.
cares needs, if they're using some, they either have they have to know what the implementation is going to do, or else they need to surround every call with a try catch.
Yeah.
If it's throw not implemented exception, then that is clearly a bug on the part of the person who wrote the channel reader or writer that didn't support it.
But at that point, literally just make it abstract. Like, take the breaking change, just make it abstract, force people to react to it.
And
Well,
we can-
the difference is that abstract will guarantee break everybody, no
Yeah,
matter what they
we can-
call the
no,
API.
We have no evidence anyone outside of our implementation
For
system.
reusable libraries, this abstract approach
Yeah.
completely doesn't work. I wrote my code. It does work, and now I didn't even upgrade.
In the
I loaded
implementation,
basically I loaded my component in an app that forcefully upgraded the version, and now I'm broken.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would work.
So to make the loader happy, in the implementation, it can be virtual 0 or virtual -1, and in the ref, it's abstract. You upgrade your ref, you must implement this method.
You could do that too.
Like,
Wasn't that your soft abstract idea?
So my soft abstract was a customized version.
yeah, but we can, because we have split ref and implementation, we can make something abstract in the ref.
That's
It's
not
virtual in the
I
implementation.
think that one is
Yeah.
much better because it solves the problem of basically some libraries forcing an update to one that doesn't even call this property, and now the older version breaks because the loader refuses to load it.
That's also probably going to cause a bunch of work required for our reference assembly generator to make it no longer match the attributes.
So we'll have to come up with whatever the soft marker is, and if it sees the soft marker in the CS, it makes it abstract.
Also, if -1 is a
For
legitimate
example.
return value, meaning I don't support this, then why make it abstract in the ref? You've defined a legitimate return value, so virtual.
So
Which means everyone has to check now.
yeah, I think everyone has to check in either case. The question is, do you have a magic value, which is -1, or do you have a concrete, I returned a valid value versus an invalid? So if we do the magic value, people are going to do it, and they're probably not going to check the docs to see, can this return -1?
By the way, do we have an API to check on which runtime version I'm running currently?
For NetCore 3 and above, you can correctly get the version number. For NetCore 2.2 and below, it returns you a crazy version number that you can make no sense about.
But it never kind of conflicts. Can I write basically a check? If I'm on .NET 5, then call this property, otherwise don't.
Yes, you can write that check.
And it's going to be reliable.
But you can't do it for 2.2 or below.
That's fine, because this property is not going to work on 2.2. Therefore, we kind of have the tester to work already. The test is, am I on .NET 5 and above?
Yeah,
Well, the problem is it's not really .NET 5, right? What you would really have to check is the version number of Channels itself, because Channels is out of band.
We need the version number of the.
So you can totally upgrade the library running on a NetCore app tool thing. But again, like you can check the version number of the channel library, right? I mean, if you really want to do that, you can.
Because I think if we do the try pattern, people are going to see that it could potentially return false. They're going to check the docs. In what case can it return false? We'll have it documented that this will only return false if someone's not implemented.
Yeah.
And then they'll handle it from there. And they'll have the natural, if try get value, then do stuff, otherwise other logic that they'll have to have either way. In the other case, you're going to have magically returning -1. They're not going to account for it in the first place. They're not going to see that there's a potential bug until they happen to run against some implementation.
My main objection to the try pattern is that, to me, try pattern is about like dynamic things. During the program, I call try method. It can return, either true or false depending on inputs and state of the system.
Well, and
versus
theoretically, someone can implement and it can return false.
Hopefully no
what
one
I
will
was
ever do
saying,
that.
nobody frankly should. It's like it's just gonna make the API harder to use.
It's just like try get value on dictionary. As long as you're using valid keys in the dictionary, it will never return false. Theoretically, it could return false if you give it a bad key, but in the normal state of your program, it won't return false. Or parsing APIs, as long as you're giving a good string, it won't be bad. People program for the it's returning true case, and then they have exceptional behavior for the false case.
You see an application being written that work with putting it truly an optional API that can be tested for meaningfully.
Well, Stephen, an example.
I mean,
was
for
about that.
for the diagnostic scenarios, like if you were writing a monitoring app, it would just not monitor it if it returned false.
Yeah, and is that acceptable? Like, presumably, you wouldn't want your monitoring to stop working.
I don't know what the alternative would be.
I guess I'm just trying to ask, like, if it returns false or true, can you make the decision and apps still function based on?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the scenario that Mike Mark, is it's just additional diagnostic information. It makes his debugging easier. So if the count is not available, then his debugging will be harder.
Well, that was my thought as well, but it looks like we already have something that in the debug. This is more.
This is production.
Diagnostic system.
This is I want to have every 10 seconds I want to pull the length of my queue, and I want to be notified if it's getting too long, because that suggests something has gotten out of hand.
Yeah, I said debugging, I meant like diagnostics, tracing, monitoring, operations, basically.
Well, then, for the scenario that you just mentioned, Steve, I would actually probably want to fail the application if the channel reader can't give me that information, because it means I can't monitor the application successfully.
Exactly.
That's not the only thing that is monitoring.
But that means you are unable to use the entire implementation that is otherwise fine, just because that one thing you want to monitor isn't available. So what are you're going to rewrite it from scratch?
No, what I would do is I would block it in staging and wouldn't even let it go to production. I would tell my development team, you have to create something that's monitorable.
This thing, it's not monitoring the count. He's monitoring many things, and from time to time the monitoring says the app failed. And then he analyzes the traces, and if he has more information in traces, it's easier to analyze what happened.
I mean, maybe. I could see using this property as a way to spin up more workers if the reader's not quickly enough.
Right. That was the reasoning behind the similar counts were exposed for the thread pool APIs, which was people by default can just use the thread pool and it will work. But in cases where the backlog ends up growing too much, they want to have customized logic to say, let's distribute the work more, or let's hold off on queuing more work until such and such happens. And that's basically what this API allows. It allows you to say, if there's too much in the backlog, then we can fork and do some different logic. Otherwise, we'll just continue working as is. In worst case, you get some worse performance.
It can be used for that too.
Which I think is also the purpose from the guy's original post.
I mean, so let's go back. So I think if our intent is that we want generally just a count, I think having a virtual count that throws and then having a way for people to know that they should override this, I think seems like the right approach. And then it's just a function of, are we okay with doing the abstract and reference assembly but virtual implementation trick, or are we doing a soft virtual thing or soft abstract thing with some custom attribute and analyzer, or how are we going to do that?
The call site would look nicer if you had a can count property and a count property that threw. That way, if your code doesn't handle the can count, you just get the exception. Like, there's no magic number, like there's no try pattern that you always have to handle. It's like you get an exception, you don't have to handle it if you don't want to. If you don't handle it, it'll fail your application.
But aren't most people going to end up using this for special logic or keeping their normal logic? They're not necessarily going to say, use this logic or fail, in which case the try pattern fits that bill.
No, so I think most people would literally just call the count property, and if they care that there might be an implementation that doesn't support it, then they call can count beforehand.
So I'm looking at, we have 3 implementations of channels. We have one that's bounded, we have one that's unbounded and for use with any number of producers and consumers, and then we have one that's for use with a single producer and a single consumer at a time. And the comment that is on the internal count property on the single consumer, single producer one is, this method is not safe to use concurrently with any other members that may mutate this collection. Which suggests to me that without a lot of due diligence investigating the implementation and or changing it, this one will not be able to return a count.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'd want to throw.
Well, if there was a tester.
Yeah. Yeah, there would have to be a tester.
And now I need to make 2 calls?
You need to make
every
2
time I want to
calls, yes.
Why is that better?
It's not better, it's just more usable.
Is it though?
Why is it
it's the same number of steps as try get count, just with more APIs.
No, because try get count is going to return false and out and int. If I don't want to make my application have to even think about that, I literally just call the count property.
That's out underscore, because if it's true, you're going to want to get the count. Otherwise,
Yes, but
why check it?
Now I have to write the if statement. Like, you're now forcing me, the caller, to write an if statement. If I didn't,
You don't
want
have to write
write
the if statement.
Well, what do I do then?
The same thing you just said you would do if you didn't want to check the can count.
Yeah, if you want a valid count, you have to check has count somewhere. So you're either not going to use it, in which case you're not going to check has count and you're never going to get a count, or you're going to use it, in which case you have to check has count and you have to get a count.
No, the scenario that I mentioned a few minutes ago is like I'm writing the simplest possible monitoring application. I expect that the implementation I'm using will work. I call the count property because there's also a can count tester. If the count property throws, it means something is wrong inside my logic and I need to address it before it goes to prod.
That's also if not try get count throw.
Yes, but now
which is normal exception handling logic for like everything.
But now I have to be aware of the fact that something might fail, as opposed to just letting it fail naturally and letting the rest of my monitoring system detect that my application has failed.
I also think that the comment that Steve was talking about in the implementation, I might be wrong, but I think we should just implement the count property even on unbounded channel. It may be like, there's an internal thing that, nobody wanted to spend in the past time to make sure that it's,
Sorry, I
safe.
don't understand what you're suggesting. Are you suggesting figure out a way to fix it or ditch this implementation?
No, figure out the way to fix it.
I'm not sure it can be fixed.
Why not?
Because it's a super low lock. There's 0 interlocked operations, 0 locks. In this special case where there's only a single producer, single consumer, count requires more interaction with the entire list, not just the head.
But if it's an approximate count, then do you care about locking it?
Yeah, it's not about getting the count, it's about crashing.
Why would it crash? Sorry.
Because if you have multiple threads that are interacting on the same state, you're in with no locks, with no interlocks, and it's not safe to do that. You can get no reference exceptions, you can get AVs or whatever, there are lots of things that can go wrong.
For reading an int, you can get...
It's not reading an int, it's walking a list. It doesn't store a count. There's no field that stores a count.
Oh, okay.
The generation of the int is complex.
I mean, the difference between try get count and has count is that I think for the has count, it's kind of clear that it's a static property of the object, right? You're not supposed to check this every single operation, right? Like it's invariant of the instance.
And secondly, I go back to there are, we keep trying to make try used here. The try guidelines say we have some APIs that throw exceptions, and performance of the exception is unacceptable. Try is an alternative. It's basically a performance of it.
Which it would be here as well, right? You can still access count and catch the exception, right?
I don't think we are saying, hey, normally we would design it with an exception. Oh shoot, we have a performance problem. Let's add a try. That's not what
I don't see a perfect.
The guidance we have on try is, if you have a try, have a non-try.
Yeah, I don't
it's
really
not,
see a performance
it is
argument
actually
there.
just do. If you have a try, you need a non-try as well. And now
that doesn't apply to concurrency. We would never add a non-try DQ or NQ method to these types.
That's, I guess, yes, for the concurrent ones, try means something different. But
Do you have a time of check time of use?
But still for DQ, you could imagine an API that throws for DQ if there's nothing in the queue.
yeah, which just calls try
But
DQ
it would
and then
be too
throws.
slow, so we added a try version. So to me, it's consistent. The DQ it doesn't follow the hey, have a non-try version part of the guideline, but at least the guideline is used, or the try pattern is used for what it was designed for. This one, I would say it's not. We can change guidelines, we can keep adjusting them. I'm just saying we have a guideline for exactly this thing. It's a new support that we want to add without breaking changes. We already have a pattern for it. and it's the tester doer. It's not try.
Yeah.
And it has the advantage. I buy that there's some complexities here with, the single producer channels, but
what is the complexity? I mean, you could just return false for those guys. I mean, it becomes an optional feature, right? You can decide to not implement it even if you're aware of the feature, right?
The tester-doer pattern is just the try pattern with 2 APIs rather than.
well, no, but also with the implication that it doesn't change over the lifetime of the. It's a property of a type. It's not a property. It's not a state of the instance or inputs.
What is the state of the instance?
Right. We have other places in the framework where the try pattern doesn't necessarily change whether it returns true or false. The floating point parsing APIs.
Only after your changes.
Yeah, because that's the IEEE compliant way to do it.
No. Parsing APIs use try because of performance.
Yes, but for floating point, they can never fail.
Oh, yeah,
They
it can. Try parse Q. Or double that try parse Q.
I believe that returns false.
That should return false.
Yeah, so it fails.
Right, but that's not an exception. It will never throw an exception.
Well, the parse method will, right?
Yeah, double that parse will throw on if you ask it to parse Q.
And the try parse shouldn't throw for another input. That's the whole point of the API.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, to me, the reason why I think the tester doer makes sense is because, like your scenario earlier, right? Like you don't want to care about it. You just directly call count and it blows up, right? And then I think in Levi's scenario, the idea would be something very high up in the stack that actually takes a channel reader or produces a channel reader or a channel writer. That's the part where you may check, do you have a count? No? Okay, you blow up early, right?
And also in 5-10 years, like literally, there would be no reason for you to check this.
Well,
unless you use that, but you basically just know which channel you use and you just call the method.
I mean, it's a bit like stream, right? Like, can read, can write, can seek, right? Depending on what stream you get, you have some combination thereof, right? And most code never checks it.
Well, but if I know that, but there's exactly. I think it's analogous. If I use, memory stream, for example, I already know that I can seek. Right. So I don't ever check. You never check on memory stream.
No, it's more for the
let me see.
No, it's more for the receiver, right? So let's say you write xdocument.save or something to the API. Yeah. Most people don't check. They just directly try to write to the stream, and if it blows up, well, then the caller gets an exception that says you passed me something readable, but I need something writable.
It sounds like what we almost want is something in the language that says, here's a try do something method. I'm just going to call do something. Please, language or something else, wrap that try call and then throw an exception if it didn't succeed because I don't know how to handle failure on my own.
Well, we already have that, right? I mean, you literally just call count, implementation will throw for you. I mean, like that.
I mean more generally.
I think there's also a difference between the stream APIs and this one. The stream APIs, you have can read, can seek, and you end up performing a function call that may not return a value, such as seek. Whereas in this case, you are clearly trying and then getting a value, and there's a clear difference between those two.
I'm not sure I understand because I mean,
well, in one you're doing a check and then you're receiving a value, and then the other one you are doing a check and then performing an action.
Well, I mean, can read returns true, and then I call read that fills a buffer.
Right,
it's
but
the same thing.
write and seek don't, for example.
Sure.
So it's a difference of you generally want to have an output on the false case, right?
No, I mean, like if you write xdocument.save, you cannot operate until you get a stream that can write. There is no else case. The else case is write different code, give me a different stream. There is no alternative output for that.
But in this case, there is. The alternative is you
depends
just don't
on what you do.
monitoring.
No, it depends on what you do. But if your whole feature is monitoring, you fundamentally cannot operate if you can't observe this thing. So you would basically, if you wrap a channel reader or do something to that extent, then you would forward it to your consumer and say, you passed me the wrong channel reader, channel writer because I cannot operate.
Right, but is there ever a case where you would want to check, get a true, and then not immediately get the value back?
Yeah, because like as I said earlier, like imagine you're writing a monitoring channel reader, channel writer, where you basically construct a channel reader that just wraps another one. You would just fail early in the implementation and say, you must pass me something that is that has a count. I will not work if you could. And then later down, like when you actually like call read or write and you do the monitoring, that's when you actually call count, right?
Is there a concern with the can count method where now people perceive can count to be accurate? So if can count returns true, then count will be accurate rather than estimate.
Well, it's accurate for a point in time, like Steve said.
Right, but what if is that going too far? Hey, can count this property on this instance returns true. That means it's going to be accurate not just point in time, but even through concurrent usage.
I mean, like, it can't be accurate because you read the count and someone calls add or some other consumer calls DQ. Like, the count is now wrong. Like,
No, I know. So I'm saying if you have
it's right-ish at any point in time, and unless you are the sole producer and sole consumer, which you could be, you don't know. Like,
and what if the access to the count property is under a lock, and that's what the can count guarantees. So that's what I'm saying is a perception.
No, I think there's a difference between. So the tester doer is not about will this operation succeed. It's about do I have this feature, right? Like if you have can write on a stream. Well, if your disk is full and you try to write 4 gigabytes, like it will fail, right? But like, but like this is the file that you.
It basically means calling write won't throw not supported exception.
Yeah.
That's really what it means.
Yeah.
That's in fact what it's documented. Can read on stream says if this is false, read will throw not supported exception.
Yeah.
Do we want to call it can count, or do we want to call it has count? Because can seems weird.
Probably.
Really want to call it can count?
Can has count.
If you name,
exactly.
If you
has
name
count?
the method itself get count rather than use a property, then can get count.
Is get count supported?
Normally we use can. If you look at stream as a precedent.
Don't we have has as well?
But why would we not make it a property? Because to indicate that its performance
No, I would make it a property.
equivalent to the field. Oh, okay.
Well, the guidelines generally say that property getters should be simple operations and not having.
Alright. Just straight to Christoph stuff.
All right, so.
The stream might have cut out again.
Oh, I mean, there's nothing I can do. Like network is network. I cry in a corner. That's the best I can do. All right, Krista, do you remember your ID? Probably not, right?
No.
That's what I feared. Did you file the issue though? You did, right?
42684.
426. Why the fuck is it not in the API review list?
Because it's API suggested.
Oh, somebody did not follow the process.
Is it ready for review? Okay.
This means you owe us beer.
Is this 450?
Look, now the API is ready for review.
And you also set the milestone?
As if we can, not that it makes a difference. Oh god, this is only a few APIs.
Oh, Emma, have you updated your tool so it's tracking .NET runtime now?
I have. I mean, it's a config file change, so yeah, let's say I have.
Okay.
So let me walk you through the background.
Let's do it.
So let's kind of focus on making a signature. So like you start with the data, then you hash it, then you assign a hash. So the algorithm basically goes to this pipeline and in the end produces like two values, RMS. The original DSA kind of doesn't tell you how to encode the RMS parameter. So like eventually like we decided that we were gonna just like index for the IEEE. Also added the configuration. And the other specs later like kind of started using different encoding, which matches the like basically it's ASN1 encoding, specifically their sequence, which encodes the string values. Basically the format is different, but the overall we have the first option. This basically adds the overloads
the DSA signature format, and it'll be like how you want to signature, and kind of so basically like all of the methods I'm adding here is essentially like the core of this feature is like sign hash and the from DSA and DSA, and the rest is kind of like helper methods which kind of follow the.
So to make sure I understand, you basically just we have those methods. You just added overloads that take this new enum value, and then maybe some helpers that.
Except for the protected virtual, because we already have virtual members which do the same thing and the guidelines. And I added also one more overload, get max signature size to make the read-only span overloads. I mean, sorry, the overloads which output the signature into the span more useful, because like otherwise you cannot. So that's the only.
So for the span-based APIs. Do we have? Oh, we do have a method that writes to a destination bar. And can it be? Should it be operation status-based API? Like, can you continue? There's no way to continue. If the destination is not large enough, you have to restart.
What about bytes consumed? I see.
It either succeeds in its entirety or fails. So there's no operation status.
The amount of data written, so for IEEE 1363, on any instance, it will always output the same. The RFC 3279, you can call sign over and over and over and over and over again, and it will fluctuate essentially plus or minus 4 bytes. So that's why that one is, that's why the answer, it's not get signature size, it's get max signature size. Because there's, as part of the algorithm, it has to, like, the native layer generates a random number, does math, and then comes back and says this was the answer. Essentially, we'll just never call it unless you give us the thing that's bigger than the max signature size. Otherwise, OpenSSL will happily do it.
But I don't understand. So that's a size of the signature, or it's size of this? It cannot be size of the signed data, because this
The size
API.
of the signature.
What about this API? Try sign data core.
Yeah.
That takes the destination. Can I estimate the size of the destination?
That's what the get max signature.
Oh, that doesn't take.
The signature size is always
independent from the size of the.
If you call the sign with exactly the same parameters couple of times, you'll get different sign, and the size might differ specifically for
the signature length does not vary based on the size of the
okay.
The signature is always a fixed size, plus or minus 5 bytes on.
So I just diff DSA and EcDSA, like they seem to be identical except that one is called signature, the other one is called sign, like either create signature versus sign hash.
Right.
Can you explain the difference between those two?
There's none.
In .NET Framework 1, they called it create signature on DSA and sign hash on RSA, and no one uses DSA, so when we made EcDSA, we made it match RSA sign data and sign hash instead of sign data and create.
And I also assume that the casing of those acronyms we grandfather.
Which DSA and EcDSA, they're existing types. Yeah. Well, speaking of casing, like IEEE should be all uppercase, but whatever.
In 5 of the other places we've used it, it's lowercase, and we only have it uppercase in System Math IEEE Reader. So in all the other, like networking and other IEEE cases, it's capitalized lowercase.
It's the IEEE P1363A specification. Sometimes you see it written with an A on the end, and sometimes you don't. So.
Can we assume that nullability is enabled for all these APIs? It looks like.
I would assume.
Yes, and therefore nothing changes. Like byte array, can't be null, stream can't be null, And the other thing is you have this type called DSA signature format. Should it be the formatter? Because I can't find this type anywhere.
It's listed here at the top. It's an enum.
Oh.
What's being added in this?
Okay.
What I also considered I was just like this one is kind of like
New classes, but we haven't been maintaining those at type.
Okay. Going back to the diff, like create signature and verify signature versus verify data, sign, hash. Should the parameters be consistent? Because we use RGB hash.
I follow the existing conventions. I don't mind changing it, but
They're consistent to the classes that they belong on. They should not be consistent with each other.
Yeah.
Even though the span API has it called hash, but the binary API is called RGB hash.
Yep.
I see.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
I don't remember why RG is.
It's randomly
Hungarian for
generated
array.
bytes.
Huh?
It's randomly generated bytes.
I thought RG meant array for some reason.
No, so our RGB in the context of this basically means that a hash function is a pseudo-random function, which means that the output of a hash function is basically random bytes. So RGB is randomly
Whereas
generated
for
bytes.
an office code, RG was always used as a prefix for anything that was a.
It stands for range.
Yeah, so it's not randomly generated. It's range of bytes.
Oh,
Yeah.
We've always used it as the output from a DRGB or DRBG, whatever.
Yes.
Is this the turning point for the API where we have span APIs that we don't add new APIs with the RGB parameter in the name? Like don't add RGB in the parameter name.
Where overloading create signature, the rules for overloads are
Yeah,
you
we
match
try to
the
be
thing.
consistent.
Okay.
Like, do not vary the name between overloads.
But that's why you call it
One thing we
data
can
because the
consider
existing one is
perhaps
called data,
like
right?
the DSA in this the enum or letters. I'm not sure what does because the DSA class is
And with RSA signature format or whatever we call, decided that we would keep the RSA all caps because the class RSA. Government doesn't trademark
RSA?
DSA.
Oh, sorry. IEEE is also a trademark, which is why it should be all capital.
It's like the only change would be
For casing, that's the only change
I would leave it the little way unless you feel that we're obligated.
Yeah,
to make
we've
it capital,
we've
because
Yeah.
not done it
capitals
elsewhere
otherwise-
except for the math API for IEEE.
Yeah.
I honestly.
I would try to make it consistent with what we have in crypto already. Like if crypto already has it in lowercase, I would do
We don't,
lowercase.
like Tanner said, the only place where we already have it is in the math APIs, and it's capital.
Well, we've got it in system numerics as IEEE 754 helpers, lowercase. System net primitives for sockets, that's IEEE 12844.
Lower.
So
That's
I don't-
lower.
I don't see, I'm checking APIs I've done. Oh, there, okay.
So system.sockets address family.
Yes.
IEEE is lowercase.
That was probably a mistake. But
Lots of OData. IEEE 7454 is also lowercase.
I mean, given that these APIs will never win a prize for beautiful,
yeah,
I honestly don't care.
whatever.
To me,
I3E.
I3E.
Just convince C#
Jesus
to allow superscript, and then we can do IEQ.
Is that something you want to showcase?
Small caps.
No, not really. But like this is the fun thing with like browser windows that keep popping up and out of existence. All right, so let's do this. Let me. All right, so then what's the ruling?
Keep the caps as is here then.
I guess in no caps. Keep the caps as non-caps or keep the caps as caps.
As it's listed
Okay,
here on the
so
map.
then.
I have to say it reads like
Yes. Because the thing is, like, when I introduced the UTF-8 helper type, like, I put lowercase tf, even though we used it uppercase everywhere else. Because I'm like, it's not a trademark, it's just an acronym, and our casing guidelines say acronyms should only have the first thing capitalized, unless it's a proper name.
But does that not capture your feelings when you use crypto API?
recently I was replying to some email not email, a GitHub question from a customer. Why we have complexity in the casing guidelines? Why don't we just always use Pascal casing?
I saw
And I
it.
said that it's because System.io would look like a namespace for manipulating a moon of Jupiter.
Yes.
I liked Arthur's response to that, by the way.
What?
I liked Arthur's response to that.
Oh, I didn't see more response.
His response was, "Thank God we avoided that confusion."
Just wait until we actually have to add something like iPhone to an API name.
The guidelines say avoid trademarks.
This is a specification.
It is a specification.
Do we foresee adding more
Technically
enums?
speaking, we can remove that prefix. Kind of like,
Oh, more obvious. I look at it and it's like,
Well,
oh,
it's
thank
kind of-
God. It's
You know exactly what spec to
you
look
know
at.
what to look up when you look at this thing.
Yeah.
But like, technically speaking, it doesn't have to be there. Like,
You-
can either
like-
read the spec
Yeah.
name or the.
Yeah.
Let's face it, if I have to use the API, I will hit F1. There will be some code sample. I will copy and paste that
There's not gonna be a
bugger
code sample
into
for
my
this.
code and then move on with my
You think
life.
there's going to be a code sample for
Well,
this?
either that or it will be on Stack Overflow. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm not going to like go through the IEEE specification by hand. Like, let's be real.
Do we expect more enums or things to be added to this type?
Possibly
So in that
means
case, would the parameter list just keep growing? Because right now we have hash algorithm as the enum or struct. I
No,
guess.
they wouldn't. You wouldn't have additional parameters. You might have different entries in the existing.
Oh yeah, I meant like complete new types of enums.
They would at that point. What we would probably have is something that's not DSA. So we would probably have a different type, a different class entirely.
Okay. So presumably, like I'm looking at like parameters, right? We have data, offset count, and then hash algorithm, and now we added signature format.
Yeah.
Is it expected to add more APIs, more parameters to this API?
I don't think so,
Okay.
because again, at that point, we're really talking about different algorithms.
Yeah. I mean, the way crypto works is that it's very fixed in terms of inputs and outputs. And like,
Yeah.
if you fuck with those, then you probably have a different algorithm anyway.
I mean, we added this.
Yeah, but this is like what we added here is the where do I get this now? Fuck. The soup is impossible to see. But basically, like if you squint, it's basically just a different way to do the exact same operation, right? It's just like if you look at how these things are constructed very often, like especially with span and non-span,
Yeah.
all you do is you just change the way the inputs and outputs are being passed in, but you still have the same number of inputs and outputs, right?
Yeah. Probably the closest analogy to what you were asking for, Asim, is when we added GCM support. It's a different mode of operation for algorithms like AES.
Yeah.
The thing is, once you start talking about stuff like that, it's so significantly different that we actually introduced a brand new type for it, because some of the other parameters simply made no more sense at that point.
Should we default the existing overloads, like when the one that takes byte array hash algorithm?
No, because the existing APIs already have appropriately chosen defaults. I just don't remember.
They do it.
So there's DSA.sign data already,
Yeah,
for instance.
yeah.
So that chooses an appropriate. Yeah.
What I mean is, since we're adding a new parameter, what is it? DSA format.
Yeah.
Do we?
Like an ask presentation for ECL leadership, the UTF-8 strings and some others. This reminded me, we need the URI. No, what is it called? Like the escaping that we don't support. Base 64 URI escape.
I thought that was in CoreFX.
No, that was on my plate. We should add it.
Tracking it?
I was tracking it.
Okay.
Okay.
So just like we had in basically 4 APIs that are
Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
statics.
Yeah.
So you're
Add.
tracking that then.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can find an issue.
So I'm like, I know there was an issue for it.
There is no issue, but yeah, we could propose.
Okay.
It.
Easy.
Yeah, it's not that difficult.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
This for some reason reminded me.
Unless you have
Sure.
something else, like where you need more state or context from this. Okay. It's just a transform, right?
One. Tanner.
Is that ready?
Yeah. We pushed it off last.
Oh, is that the one with 500 overloads again?
No.
No, I see that's not
Yeah,
that bad.
those are existing. So basically, there is on x86. There's two encodings. There is the legacy encoding, which is basically all machines prior to 2011, and then there's the VEX encoding, which is for AVX and above. These two have different semantics when you have to consider what memory loads can be folded into the instruction, so you get one instruction rather than two. On older hardware, those instructions were required to be aligned. And so we can only fold a load aligned into, for example, an add call. Whereas on VEX and above, they are unaligned. They don't actually check the alignment anymore. And so we can only fold unaligned loads. For the most part, people writing APIs will either always do unaligned, or they will pin the array, force their data to be aligned, and then operate on it as if it was aligned for the entire data length. So the proposal is we expose this API, which in debug mode will validate alignment, regardless of whether you're on AVX or legacy. But during release mode, it will always be folded to the correct load. So it will be an unaligned no check load on AVX hardware and an aligned check load on legacy.
So debug, what does it do? It throws an exception, or?
Right, it will throw an access violation exception.
But unaligned loads, do they not work, or they are just slow?
So unaligned loads are, on modern hardware, they're as fast as aligned loads, provided you're not crossing a cache boundary, which is why many people pin their data and then ensure the data is aligned regardless. So this is just a convenience API to say, I've done the appropriate checking to make sure it's aligned. During debug mode, you'll get the additional validation that is in fact aligned. But we will always, regardless of whether you're on old hardware or new hardware, emit the efficient encoding.
But if you on new hardware and it's crosses the cache line boundary, what happens?
You get a perf hit.
It
still
on
works.
modern
It's just a
hardware
perf
is
hit.
always just a perfect. And then on older hardware, do we ever fail, or it's always also just a perfect hit?
It depends. So if you're doing load aligned, it will fail. If you're doing load unaligned, then there will be a perf hit, and it's even more significant.
And do we have explicit when users use those APIs, they don't explicitly say whether it's load aligned or
No.
The existing APIs there are, yeah.
Yeah, the existing APIs are. So if you scroll down, actually they're right there at the top. The existing APIs are load unaligned, which is just load vector 128, and load with alignment checking.
Yeah.
And the top API would do load aligned on old hardware and load unaligned on new hardware. But on new hardware in debug mode, it would also validate that your data is in fact aligned.
So we do actually call load aligned in a few places today, especially in code paths like what Tanner mentioned earlier, where like a lot of our ASCII processing stuff, we calculate the alignment manually, and then inside of a tight loop, we call load aligned. Are you suggesting that code like that would be changed to use the new API?
Right.
Because it'll properly fold into other operations?
It will properly fold. It will be more efficient and allows you to write one code path that handles both cases, rather than having to write two code paths with, for example, explicit debug assert.
Why would I use this instead of unsafe.read unaligned of vector 128 of float?
Because read unaligned won't be folded on legacy hardware.
So this will be folded on legacy?
This will be folded.
And legacy is pre-2011?
Yeah, or for example, the MacBook I have supports AVX, but not AVX2.
Okay.
And so, for example, for some combinations, also for AOT scenarios where you have to compile for legacy non-VEX encoding by default.
Sure.
That's always going to be aligned folding in that scenario, and so we end up with slightly less efficient code gen.
Got it. So I see the utility for it. The name unsafe probably isn't really sitting well with me, because normally unsafe means memory unsafe, because we're dealing with pointers. Hey, look, pointers.
Yeah, it's pointer, and in this case it's memory unsafe because
you could AV.
Right, because if you're only testing on new hardware and you happen to have aligned data and the GC didn't move it, then your test could theoretically pass. But in practice, that's likely not to happen.
So you said on new hardware, this still forces an aligned access and debug?
Yeah, and in debug, it will emit a load aligned instruction and not fold. But in release mode, it will appropriately.
And we're talking about users' apps in debug or release, correct?
Yes.
The callers.
So
Wait, sorry, say that again?
Like this behavior of debug versus release is happening on the caller's
it's
side.
user app, not corelib.
How do we know what the user app is compiled as?
Optimization's enabled or not.
Yeah. Because the JIT knows whether you want to have optimized code or not, and it's based on that.
Oh,
Yeah, so
okay.
if you're compiled on tier 0, it will do alignment checking. If you're compiled for tier 1, or aggressive optimization or anything like that, it will be it will just do unaligned checking on new hardware.
So if you're running under a debugger, then it will do the alignment checking.
That depends.
Yeah.
That depends on how whether it was compiled, whether or not you have the suppress module optimizations checked, and
I mean, the default behavior is that's what you get, but yeah.
Well, because normally when we talk about debug versus release, we talk about the generated IL, not about what the JIT is code genning. Normally.
Yeah, I guess
this
we should
is
clarify.
if optimizations are enabled, then hold it.
Remind me, when are optimizations enabled versus not enabled?
They're disabled on tier 0 under debug mode. If you suppress JIT optimizations via the environment variable or the checkbox. And they're enabled for tier 1 aggressive optimization release mode.
This means presumably our unit tests actually would run fully optimized.
It depends.
Oh, because you introduced the ability to run them under a non-optimized JIT?
No, so for unit tests, we have the ability to run with each of the environment variables for enable and disable, and then we always run in I think check mode.
Okay. Because the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to figure out, because I'm probably the biggest consumer of these APIs in core CLR, so I'm trying to figure out like how would this affect the code that I write.
Have we considered adding 128-bit aligned arrays to CLR?
It's a GC. So there's going to be an API that's already been approved, it's just not been implemented yet, that allows you to allocate a pre-pinned array that can be aligned to whatever value you want. The GC will never move it as long as it's alive, and you can do that. But individual instance members on the heap, we've got no way to currently align to 16-byte boundaries.
Yeah. And those special arrays that you mentioned, they are still GC arrays, correct?
Right, they're regular arrays. They're just
it's just they will not be moved.
Yeah, it's a
They are
special
like on the
GC API
large
for
object
allocating.
heap?
No, it's a new pinned object.
Well, there's a new GC API where you allocate an array and you can specify how you want it.
And would you rather use those? Like I assume it would be better to use this new heap.
There's not necessarily any guarantee that the input data for a given algorithm comes from one of those arrays.
Yeah. Also, like the algorithms that I'm thinking of all take spans, which means they have
don't
to
know.
pin.
Yeah. Users would have to know.
But
Yeah.
it's pretty trivial to write an algorithm which pins the array, checks the alignment, and does at most two unaligned reads or writes to deal with trailing and preceding elements that are unaligned.
And if those new arrays, will I be able to check whether, like, if I receive a span or an array to my algorithm, can I check on which heap?
I don't think there's an API for that.
If
I imagine that'd be cheap. That'd be more expensive than just
really
pinning and checking the
I
alignment.
mean, if you already have a span coming in, like you have a pointer to the data. Like the data is going to exist in memory somewhere. You don't get to control where it is. The only thing you can do is react to it. And at that point, like Tanner said, just pin and go.
Yeah, because it's likely cheaper to pin and check the alignment than it is to have the GC check which.
Well, I would imagine we allocate those arrays and we would put it somewhere in the object header. space.
There is a
That's the problem.
yeah. So we do have space, but checking the object header already implies that you've pinned the object. And if you've pinned the object already,
You don't have to pin the object.
you do have to pin to check the object header. It is mandatory.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The GC can't track refs before the object method table. I mean, I think Tanner had a proposal for like how to fold it into a like 2-parameter move instruction or something to do that check, but a 2-part instruction, I don't know. But yeah, actually you'll see wherever we check the bits in the object header, it always involves pinning. It's just a consequence of how the GC works. And it also involves interlocked. Fun. Yeah, so I guess the other naming suggestion here would be, should this be load aligned vector unsafe? Because it does require alignment, at least in debug.
I think.
So that's the thing I just don't understand. So what is the intent? So the intent is I call this API when I know the data is aligned.
Right.
So I assume it's aligned. And if it's not aligned, then in debug I will crash and then release this perf will suck.
Then in release, on new hardware, perf will suck. And on old perf will be less than ideal. And on old hardware, you will get an access violation.
I see, and in debug, we make sure that you always get an AV no matter what the hardware is running.
Right. Basically, I would have written load align vector 128, but now I'm writing something else in place of load align vector 128.
That way you get the efficient code gen on both new and old hardware.
Which makes me think that I probably still want the word align somewhere in the method name, because the method is not expected to succeed if the data is misaligned.
We shipped the existing APIs we've already shipped in Core 3.0, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the other ones are existing. The unsafe one is the new one. I'm fine with calling it load align vector 128 unsafe.
Yeah, so you're okay with aligned in the name then?
But so we have these I think we have a convention we call the methods throwing. If we kind of have a variant that throws or doesn't throw, because for you unsafe basically means it will throw, correct?
No, unsafe means that that it doesn't strictly always do the alignment checking. It's unsafe because it doesn't always fulfill the alignment.
The alignment checking is not a typical CLR exception. It's actually a processor AV,
which the CLR catches and converts to an access violation.
But you basically at that point your process is kind of
that's always fatal in core CLR, right? An AV, as opposed to a typical NoRef.
No, I don't believe it's always.
Okay.
Should we expose the encoding legacy versus Vex in the API surface rather than being implied?
No, I don't think that bit's important. These are already low-level APIs, and people who are using them are expected to already be familiar with how they work and things like that.
Like this would actually optimize some of the code we've written internally if we could take advantage of this.
I get that, but the whole motivation for this API is that for Vex versus, at least what I'm reading, legacy, there's different folding and throwing semantics.
Right.
Is that something we just document?
Yeah, that's just something that we'll put in.
We don't want to expose that?
No, I don't think it's necessarily important.
If I, as the caller of these APIs, had to say, if legacy encoding this, otherwise this, like that introduces more opportunities for failure into my own code.
Okay.
Because it's now forcing me to duplicate code effectively.
And the primary purpose of this API is if you want to support hardware for like the benchmarks games that we've written stuff for in the past, or modern hardware, you end up having to write basically the same code twice, where the only difference is load aligned versus load unaligned.
Yeah.
And it's less than ideal. And so this API solves that problem.
Yeah.
So one question I have is, so what is the behavior of load vector 128? It basically means I don't care about alignment, just make it work?
No, so load vector 128 is always an unaligned load.
Always.
And so it will always succeed provided the memory is readable or writable.
Right.
On new hardware, that means it can be folded into the instruction. But on old hardware, it can't be folded. So for example, in AOT scenarios, in cross-gen, ready to run, in all those scenarios, if you use unaligned for the better tier 1 throughput, you end up hurting,
Yeah.
ready to run scenarios.
So if I can also help simplify what Tanner had said, imagine where you have, I want to read this memory address and put it into this XMM register. Read this other memory address, put it into XMM2. So I now have two XMM registers. Now I want to add those two things together into another XMM register. What Tanner had mentioned with folding is I can do the first read address 1 into XMM register 1, and at the same time, read from memory address 2 and add it directly into XMM1, for instance, without also blowing the XMM2 register. So it also helps make the register allocator more efficient.
If you scroll down just a little bit, I've got examples of this. And
perfect.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because I'm just still struggling with the naming. So basically, what's the difference then between load vector 128 and load aligned vector 128?
Load aligned always does alignment checking. And so on old hardware, it can be folded into the instruction. And on new hardware, it can't be. But it always does alignment checking.
Yeah, there are actually two different instructions.
Which one is then the one I should be using when I want to write fast code?
It depends on if you're on old hardware or new hardware, which is the purpose of this API.
So basically, you're saying if old hardware, load vector, if new hardware, load aligned vector. Is that
No, it's
the other one? Yeah, close enough.
So
you want your data to be aligned because aligned memory is faster to access.
Right.
But on new hardware, you have to use unaligned, and on old hardware, you have to use the aligned instruction.
Yes.
And so this API provides I'm using the aligned because that's the fast way to do it, but I want to do the efficient encoding regardless of what hardware I'm on.
By the way, the reason why I think Imo and me are a bit confused, and maybe other people in the room, when you say aligned, it has potentially two different meanings. Whether the memory is aligned or whether the instruction that you're calling is aligned instruction. But sometimes it's not super clear from the context.
So I had mentioned earlier a lot of the code that I've written to make things like ASCII and UTF-8 processing more performant would benefit from stuff like this. Because we do aligned-only reads,
right.
But on newer hardware, which is primarily what we test on, those aligned reads won't fold into the next instruction, as Tanner had mentioned, which means we're actually emitting bigger code gens.
So why do you do aligned reads rather than unaligned reads?
Because I know the data is aligned, and I want the access to fail if the data is not, because it means there's a bug in my code.
I see. So you would use the new one?
I would use a new one.
So is it then fair to say that logically the new operation is load aligned vector 128, except that we use a better encoding that we know will not work on older hardware?
No, it's
It does the most efficient thing regardless of what generation of hardware you're on.
And the expectation is that the data is aligned, and we will do validation of that in unoptimized code.
Okay.
So that sounds to me that the new API is neither the equivalent of load vector 128 nor the equivalent of load aligned vector 128.
Right. It's a hybrid of both in a sense, depending on what hardware you're running on.
However, because it might AV if the data is unaligned, that's why I had proposed adding aligned to it.
So that's what I'm saying. I mean, my original proposal would have been unsafe load aligned vector 128 because that's kind of the closest we have in terms of naming convention. But that kind of implies that it's basically load aligned vector 128, except you don't do the check, so you may blow up.
So I think load aligned vector 128 unsafe would fill Levi's requirements, make it easy to find, and would also...
So we usually don't use unsafe as a suffix. It's usually a prefix.
On a lot of the vector stuff we do because we want to keep the method groupings together. I think you have other vector APIs aside from the intrinsics that do that.
You know, I wonder
what? The suffix?
Yeah, the suffix for unsafe, because you want the method groupings together.
Well, they are grouped in IntelliSense because it's IntelliSense.
So vector 128.createScalar and vector 128.createScalar unsafe. For a lot of the vector stuff, we actually already have unsafe as a suffix.
I think we should honestly think about the guideline. I think we should generally strive for making it the prefix because it is probably the first thing you should be reading.
Well, these are already unsafe because they take pointers. It's hardware intrinsics.
Like all I'm saying is that is the general pattern, the whole point of the unsafe keyword, or not the keyword, the naming convention is so that it pops. As soon as you make it a suffix, it pops a lot less because it's like somewhere in there, especially when the API name already is like 12 compound words together, and it's like, well, are you doing a load operation? Oh yeah, but that actually might AV, but that's something you have to.
So I don't feel strongly about including unsafe anywhere in the name here because you already had to write an unsafe block
We
put this
have to
inside of.
include unsafe in the name to differentiate between
Sure.
the existing.
But I think in this case, it's fine regardless. I'm just saying, like, as a naming convention, given that we use unsafe to indicate, okay, this API will do something weird that might crash.
Yeah.
Like, I think we should.
I think in general
Go
that
back to
should be
the
the
APIs,
case.
please.
I think this
Yeah,
happens
that you
to be
say
an
that, but like,
exception.
it's not that easy because.
Would it be useful to name the parameters either aligned or unaligned address? Basically, make it clear what the aligned and unaligned refers to, whether it's to the instruction that you're gonna be calling or to the expectation about the
People
memory
using
address.
this are going to understand it's the address.
Yeah. Because in the .NET framework, like we don't give you the ability to control which instruction, which memory boundary your instruction happens to be on. So we would never, like, because we don't give you that ability in the first place, there should be no expectation that anyone would be doing that. Like, if you needed that type of granularity, you would literally drop down to raw assembly. You wouldn't be writing C#.
So, according to, so what's the name that we will go with?
Load align vector 128 unsafe.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
So one question I have is there possible for a feature where I don't have to think about alignment or unaligned or aligned? Because I thought that this API would let me obfuscate that, and I don't care about aligned and unaligned. You can deal with it.
If you don't care about it, just always call unaligned and call it a day.
Which is load vector 128.
Yeah.
I see. This is more about obfuscating whether you're modern hardware or old hardware.
Yeah, this is you're codifying for the absolute best performance. You're guaranteeing your data is aligned, and you want the operations to correctly hold whether you're on ready to run or legacy hardware or new hardware.
Is the existing load unaligned vector 128, the load 138 API, is that optimal for unaligned regardless of hardware?
Well, so that always does an unaligned, but on ready to run and on old hardware, it will be 2 instructions rather than 1.
Okay.
Why can't we fix the other one?
Because it's a limitation of the hardware. And we're not going to go patch CPUs from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Such negativity.
All right, so then
We had some question about what other APIs we would want to expose this type of stuff to. AVX and store, etc.
AVX would get you the load aligned vector 256, right?
Yeah, I had a question of like, should we, for parity, also expose the equivalent on AVX? You tried to do word search and
no, I'm trying to.
Internet.
Internet keeps.
It doesn't necessarily make sense to expose on AVX because AVX is always new hardware.
Does AVX even have a load aligned vector 256?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
It still does. But it doesn't necessarily make sense there because AVX always supports the unaligned. So you could trivially just do debug assert if you want to validate alignment.
No, that's fair.
And what about the store APIs?
The store ones weren't included because there's stores don't get folded except for in a rare couple cases like extract. But I think extract always does online checking even on. I might be misremembering. But if there's a difference, then yes, it would be desirable to also expose the same for store.
Okay. Is that something that you would like defer to future?
I was going to defer to future.
Random question, Tanner. Would there be a load vector 128 of NewInt star?
No, because none of the hardware intrinsic APIs work on NewInt. The only types
we wouldn't add them in.
Well, they're
we wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, there's no hardware for it. They either operate on the 10 primitive type.
No, I mean we would fix it up to be int or long under the covers, but now we have a question of like x64 versus anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Right.
I had a follow-up question for the previous API set. If you can go back to that one, it's a quick thing.
Give me the edition number.
42684.
42682.
84. Not 24.
DSA?
Yeah. So You have the APIs that take span and return an out bytes written, but the out parameter is not the last one.
Where do you see that?
So try sign data.
Oh, yeah.
That's because it's an overload of the existing one, I suppose.
Yeah, so
The out should still go.
still the out should be the last one, shouldn't it?
Yeah. No, that's a good catch.
There are a few, 8 APIs that are like that.
Mhm.
Like all the span was an out byte written.
Oh, that's me.
Okay.
It's a holdover from COM days. Anyone here remember COM? You remember COM.
All right, so
Not very fondly, but I remember not being able to understand anything reading from books.
Do we actually have an H result type in the framework?
No, because struct wrappers are not the same as primitive values.
Make a primitive H result.
we call it in PTR.
No, H result is int.
Regular
I
int,
don't. Review. Because the world is not a better place. But the idea is be a COM plus, so we don't need H results. This is not annoying at all, Austin, just so you know.
I was just asking the question.
Yeah, you get a Q in the column that says problem maker. Like, where's the other out?
You have 8 APIs, 4 on each.
God. Also really easy to edit this. Right out. I think I got them. Oh no, there's actually more.
Okay. I think we're good then?
Out. Out.
Clearly, GitHub should have a fixer where you like right-click on it and say rearrange parameters, and it also picks up all of the call sites and all of the samples that you have written.
Now we have VS and
Respect
GitHub.
our coding guidelines.
Yes.
If only we had a text editor with that support that you could embed in JavaScript, right?
I mean, this entire weekly 2-hour session is basically us running our guidelines through the mechanical Turk that is us. So, I mean, it's automated, right?
So you're saying everybody who is in this meeting should change the title to Senior Mechanical Turk?
Yes.
Good. That's cool. But I'm the
Sorry,
because I'm actually typing it. I'm the mechanical Turk.
You are.
You're the what?
I'm the mechanical Turk
yeah.
because
Yes.
I'm actually having to type it in.
And also you are principal, so you should not change it in the title.
Principal mechanical Turk.
But we are principled, right? Like that's
Yes. Yes.
that's how that works. All right.
Principal senior mechanical.
No, principled mechanical
Yeah,
Turk.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. I think we have enough jokes for today. I think I will conclude this meeting. And it looks like we were still streaming to YouTube, even though the network keeps capping in and out. So that's good. All right. Bye bye.